If a family earns your trust in death, who would dare question what they do with your body once you're gone? Brief silence. The Hartwell Funeral Parlor was not built to serve the dead, it was designed to manufacture them, and for 2 full decades, no one suspected a thing. There is something uniquely terrifying about a killer who waits for death, but it's far more dangerous when the killer is the one preparing your grave. In the shadowed hills of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, behind a stone facade of piety and precision, stood a family whose hands performed both embalming and execution. They offered compassion to the grieving, but behind closed doors. They practiced something far older and more methodical than murder. It began, as evil often does, under the guise of tradition. Ezekiel Hartwell was not merely a funeral director, he was a tactician, a strategist of death. And from the moment he stepped into that town in 1801, the town stepped unknowingly into a trap that would last for generations. By the time the town suspected foul play, by the time 17 unexplained deaths occurred in just 3 months, in the fall of 1823, it was already far too late. The Hartwells had become something else entirely. What you're about to hear has not been taught in any classroom. These are the details that were buried not just beneath dirt and stone, but beneath institutional silence, sealed records, and a century of willful forgetting. You're not supposed to know this, but you will, you see. When the records were finally unsealed, when the few surviving journal pages were decoded, when the testimony of one dying old man forced the hand of the authorities, what emerged was not simply the story of a killer family, it was the story of a system, one that thrives in quiet towns, one that feeds on trust, one that disguises sadism as service, corruption as kindness, and manipulation as mercy. It is not an accident that the Hartwells succeeded for so long. This isn't just the tale of a family, this is a lesson in power, and men who understand power know that the most dangerous predators are the ones who dress like shepherds. The Hartwells were not merely they were observers, experimenters, builders of a methodology that reduced human life to a laboratory variable, and it is here, in their story, that we begin to uncover a disturbing truth, that the human obsession with death isn't about grief, it's about control. They lived among the people, shared meals, sat in pews, raised their children in the same soil into which they buried their neighbors. But behind the walls of their funeral home, death became ritual, precision, a kind of ancient religion practiced with scalpels instead of scriptures. And what they discovered, what they recorded, was so deeply unsettling that when the authorities finally broke in, even they suppressed the full account. Not because it was too brutal, but because it was too revealing, because it wasn't just the Hartwells, not entirely. You need to understand that once you see this kind of darkness, once you comprehend what they were really doing in that basement, start to see how these same patterns repeat, in different forms, under different names, but always the same result: control, quiet, normalcy, and then certain, unexplained death. So the question isn't just what the Hartwells did, the real question is how many others have done the same. You see, the funeral home was just a mask, a convenient cover for experimentation, for psychological manipulation, for the slow transformation of an entire family into something that by the end no longer resembled anything human. Their journal wasn't merely a record of killings, it was a manual, a guide, a codex of techniques used to manipulate communities, identify weaknesses, and eliminate subjects without suspicion. Written in code, sealed behind false walls, updated in multiple hands, it was passed from father to son like a sacred text, and it began with grave robbery. The Hartwells realized early on that the dead had no advocates. Once someone was in the ground who would look twice if their jewelry disappeared, if the casket held a weighted bag instead of a body, if the cause of death didn't quite match the symptoms. But Ezekiel was never content with petty theft. He wanted precision. He wanted to understand death. And understanding required data, patterns, trials. That's when the shift occurred. You must understand this wasn't chaotic or impulsive. It was ordered, strategic. And by the time Dr. Samuel Harrison arrived in Millbrook in 1823, the Hartwells had already perfected their system. They knew how to choose targets, how to time the deaths, how to poison slowly or quickly, how to hide the signs in plain sight. But it wasn't enough, because death wasn't the end to the Hartwells. It was just the beginning. What they kept in the basement went beyond even the worst suspicions. Preserved organs arranged in patterns that suggested study, not mourning. Chemical solutions labeled in a language even Dr. Harrison couldn't decipher. And drawings, hundreds of anatomical sketches, each more precise than the last, each bearing the names of victims already buried. And that's when he saw it. A journal entry marked Phase 3. Phase 1, poison. Phase 2, observation. Phase 3, resurrection attempts. Yes, they weren't just killing, they were trying to bring something back. The details remain. Obscure pages were burned, names redacted, but several entries mention the threshold, a reference repeated throughout the journal. Caleb crossed the threshold. Rebecca heard it speak before the threshold closed. Subject 19 remained warm for 2 hours after death, but the threshold thinned. It's unclear whether the Hartwells believed in science, magic, or something in between, but what is clear, chillingly clear, is that they believed death could be reversed if enough data were gathered, if the right ritual were followed, if the right subject were chosen. And that leads us to the last entry in the journal, written in shaky ink, dated 1 week before the Hartwell family vanished. All preparations complete. Rebecca volunteers for final stage, threshold open, sacrifice prepared, burial unnecessary. No bodies were ever recovered. The funeral home was boarded up by state officials. The property sold, the records sealed, but whispers remain. Locals still speak of strange lights in the forest, of a girl in burial clothing seen standing by the cemetery gate on cold, moonless nights, of livestock found dead with no wounds, but eyes wide with terror. You want to believe this is just a ghost story, but you can't, because too much was documented, too many deaths were hidden, too many patterns repeated elsewhere. Ask yourself, why were the records sealed for 100 years? Why was Dr. Harrison transferred and then silenced? And why after all this time does the name Hartwell still appear in classified investigations tied to institutions far beyond Millbrook? Let me say this clearly, this is not just a story about the past. This is about what happens when systems of trust are infiltrated by those who worship control more than compassion. This is about how easily death can be weaponized when no one is watching, and this is about how evil survives not by hiding in the dark but by standing in the open, offering comfort, service, and silence. You were never supposed to know this, but now you do. The deeper you descend into the Hartwell archives, the more disturbing a realization emerges, not that they were killers, but that they believed they were doing something sacred. That's what sets this apart from every other tale of horror. This was never just about death, it was about ritual, precision, belief. They weren't murdering out of desperation. They weren't mad. They were initiates, practitioners of an order so buried in time that its language wasn't passed by mouth but through method. Every corpse became a message, every incision, a symbol, every funeral, a disguised rite. They stood over bodies like priests, not undertakers, and the basement wasn't a crime scene, it was a temple. You begin to understand the Hartwell legacy only when you stop thinking like a modern man. You have to go back, way back, before Pennsylvania, before Virginia, before Ezekiel, because Ezekiel, Hartwell didn't invent this system, he revived it. There are indications buried and fragmented, letters and barely legible ledger notes that Ezekiel belonged to an older society, one that called itself the Custodians, a name found in marginalia of esoteric British grimoires, a group obsessed with the manipulation of life at the threshold of death, not just for knowledge, but for influence. What kind of influence? The kind that ancient kings were said to possess. The kind whispered about in the Vatican's sealed archives. The kind that makes a man more than a man, if only for a moment. According to a fragment recovered in a sealed envelope marked Hartwell, estate do not open, the custodians believed that when the soul leaves the body, a doorway opens. For exactly 243 seconds, a doorway that reveals everything they believed. If you could witness the soul's release, capture it not metaphorically, but literally, you could possess a power that defies description, not raise the dead, no, nothing that crude, but see what the dying saw, feel what they felt, and through enough repetition, understand what lies beyond the veil. That's what they were doing. That's why the murders were so methodical. They weren't just ending lives, they were timing them, measuring the dying breath, trapping it, observing it. They documented these moments with a kind of reverence, each death labeled not by the victim's name, but by a sequence number. Subject 1, Subject 27, Subject 66. There is one particularly horrifying entry that survived the purge. It reads, Subject 49 held between 2:06 a.m. and 2:10 a.m. Sudden expulsion of air. Audible words in unknown tongue. Martha recorded transcribed symbols. Caleb collapsed during recording described tunnels behind the ceiling. Residue found on tongue, phosphorescent under lamplight. Rebecca sobbing, claimed to see father's other face. Subject expired precisely at 243 seconds. Entry, successful. This wasn't a family of lunatics. This was a working laboratory, a spiritual siege, and their tools were not just knives and poisons, but trust, ritual, and silence. You need to ask yourself why a funeral home, because it's the perfect mechanism. Think, the community delivers the bodies willingly, suspicion is already low, the emotional atmosphere is heavy, ideal for psychological diversion, and once death is accepted, no one looks twice at what happens after. The Hartwells didn't just bury bodies, they processed them, a phrase used repeatedly in their journals. The processing must begin at warmth, meaning, as soon as the subject's life left the eyes, meaning they often watched the deaths in real, not as passive observers but as facilitators. And this is where the horror crosses into something more ancient than science. In the final recovered page of what researchers believe was Rebecca's private journal, there is a passage that is difficult to explain. We waited in the dark. Mother held my hand. She said I must not blink, no matter what. When the man in the chair stopped breathing, something moved behind him. Not a shadow, a fold, like the air bent inwards. I saw it. I think it saw me back. Rebecca Hartwell was 19. You must understand the psychological transformation it takes to write something like that, not in terror, but in serenity. She believed this was destiny. She believed her family had been chosen to witness what no other eyes had ever seen. And in this obsession with witnessing lies a profound, disturbing truth. They didn't hate their victims, they honored them. Do you understand what that means? They believed the people they killed were lucky to die under the Hartwell hands, meant to be part of something vast, something ancient, something eternal. They weren't harvesting life, they were cataloging souls. This is where the journals begin using a symbol instead of a word, a circle with 3 lines cutting through it. It appears again and again, carved on embalming tables, etched in the margins of reports, branded into the wood beneath the floorboards. Dr. Harrison called it the sigil of separation. He believed it marked those who had passed successfully. Past what, exactly, he couldn't say, but he died trying to find out. In 1831, 8 years after his visit to Millbrook, Harrison was found in a locked room, surrounded by dozens of dismembered birds, each positioned at cardinal points on the wall. He had scrawled just one sentence in his own blood. She opened it again. The room reeked of formaldehyde. And this is the moment in the descent where you must make a decision. Brother, you've been watching long enough to know this isn't just storytelling, this is initiation. You are not who you were when this began. The truths you've heard can't be unheard. And the awareness that now grows in your chest, that gnawing discomforted, is your mind waking up. So now I ask you to do something powerful. Type the words "I see through the veil" in the comments. Twice. Not for the algorithm, for you. Too. Mark this moment, to signal that you've crossed into a different realm of understanding, that you're not just consuming content, you're changing. Because the men who walk blindly are victims, but the men who choose to see become something else entirely. We're not done, not even close, because in the next section we'll uncover how the Hartwells ensured their legacy didn't die. In 1823 we'll trace their influence into the institutions you trust today, and we'll name the successors who learned from their work and applied it in prisons, hospitals, and military experiments, right here in the United States. The third generation of the Lancaster bloodline would leave the most inexplicable stains on history, events so strange that they were either forgotten or sealed inside vaults. Reverend Isaiah Lancaster III, born in 1833, was not a preacher like his forefathers. He was what you might call a manipulator of minds, a puppeteer cloaked in scripture. They said his sermons could leave grown men trembling not from guilt, but from something else. Something deeper, something darker. People wept not in repentance, but in fear, a fear they could never quite explain. By the time Isaiah III was 20 years old, the town of Millfield had already changed. Churches no longer rang bells. They tolled in slow, deliberate rhythms like funeral drums echoing over cornfields. Something had shifted, and those who dared to speak openly about the Lancaster estate up on the hill where Isaiah had taken up residence often disappeared within weeks. Others simply changed, became mute, fractured. Their eyes looked vacant, as if something had hollowed them out from the inside. According to town records, Isaiah had only 12 regular but witnesses say the true number was far higher. And they didn't sit in pews. They stood, shoulder to shoulder, in the Lancaster barn at midnight and blinking, unmoving, whispering in some primitive tongue no one dared write down. An ex named Elias Whitford, who tried to confront Isaiah about his doctrines, was later found wandering barefoot near the train tracks, speaking in riddles and coughing up feathers. Literal feathers. Inside the barn, strange patterns were burned into the rafter circles and eyes, not of Christian origin, but far older. One investigator later said the markings resembled Enochian seals, ancient symbols associated with summoning angels, or their opposites. And then there were the journals, hundreds of pages, written by Isaiah in handwriting that changed every few entries, lantered upright, reversed. Some entries appeared in mirror writing, others in cipher, but what all agreed on was this: the content was not of this world. It was around this time that young children in the area began experiencing night visitations. They described tall, pale figures that smelled like damp soil and whispered secrets into their ears, secrets about their parents, their siblings, things they should have no way of knowing. One child said, "He told me my mother killed a baby. In 1821, he said it's still in the walls." No such record existed. But days later, behind the fireplace of the child's home, workers discovered a small cuvette containing infant bones wrapped in fabric, marked with the Lancaster crest. Isaiah was never arrested. The sheriff's deputy who tried to bring him in ended up resigning the same week and moving to Oregon, said nothing, left his badge on the desk and a note that simply read, "He's not a man." From that moment forward, no official dared approach the Lancaster property again. But the fires kept burning on the hill every Friday at midnight, and the tolling bells of Millfield grew quieter each year until they stopped altogether. By 1871, the Lancaster name had become something of a whispered warning passed from parent to child like a cautionary tale, though no one dared speak it too loudly. But silence did not protect the town. That year, the Wilkins family, who lived nearest to the Lancaster estate, began experiencing what the newspapers would only call a progressive mental collapse. But the truth was far more terrifying. Their youngest daughter, Margaret, was the first to change. She stopped eating, not out of protest, but as if something had replaced her hunger with reverence. She would spend hours staring out the window toward the distant silhouette of the Lancaster manor, muttering, "He waits." Inside the veil, her older brother, Thomas, followed next. He began sketching figures with no faces, dozens of them over and over in charcoal until his fingers bled. When their mother finally tried to intervene, Thomas attacked her, screaming, "You're already gone." She said, "You left your body years ago." What no one outside the family realized was that Margaret and Thomas had both been seen walking along the forest path behind the Lancaster property just days earlier, carrying candles. Barefoot, lips moving silently in tandem, a local farmer swore he saw them enter through the back gate of the Lancaster grounds, though no one else would confirm it, and no one would follow them. Weeks later, Margaret vanished. Her shoes were found on the church altar filled with earthworms. Her dress was discovered hung like a curtain in the bell tower. Her body was never found. When questioned, Thomas simply said, "She was chosen." He later carved the same phrase into the underside of his bed frame over and over again. His hands were raw and bones showed through the skin. There was no trial. No one wanted it. Sheriff Curtis, the last lawman willing to speak publicly about the Lancasters, went to visit the estate one last time. He brought 2 deputies. Only one returned. Curtis was never seen again. The surviving deputy, James Harlan, refused to speak for the rest of his life. He took a job at a coal plant in West Virginia, married a widow with no children, and reportedly burned his own eyes with lye 10 years later, whispering, "They're still watching." That's when the townspeople started leaving, not in mass exodus, but slowly, strategically. Those who could afford to relocate did so in the dead of night, leaving behind homes, livestock, and sometimes even family. By 1885, Millfield's population had dropped by half. The school closed, the rail line was diverted, and maps of the area began to omit the town entirely, as if it never existed. But the Lancaster estate never dimmed. Its windows glowed with a low, amber light, steady, unnatural, never flickering. Those who dared get close enough to see the upper floors claimed shadowy figures still moved behind the curtains, not just 1 or 2, dozens, a procession of shapes that never crossed the same window twice, always watching, always waiting, and still, the family line continued. By the turn of the century, what remained of Millfield was little more than a skeleton of its former self, half-buried foundations, warped church pews, and the outline of homes reclaimed by forest and rot. The land was cursed, that much everyone agreed on, though few would admit it aloud. Those who had once documented the area, surveyors, historians, railroad officials, had either redacted their notes or vanished entirely. A silence descended upon the region that was not just social, but historical. It was as if Millfield had been swallowed, and yet, In 1903, a stranger arrived. He called himself Reverend Josiah Rent, dressed in formal black, with a high collar and gloved hands. He claimed to be seeking a site of great spiritual disturbance. His arrival caused barely a ripple. There was no one left to greet or warn him. But what's most unsettling is how swiftly he took up residence in the remains of the old church, and how quickly the area seemed to respond. For the first time in decades, smoke rose from the Lancaster chimneys. Reverend Rent was seen wandering the overgrown paths between the broken gravestones, murmuring to himself. Locals from neighboring counties reported hearing bells at night, though the church had no bell rope. Some claimed they saw people moving through the ruins, again hooded, slow walking in formation, always in pairs. And most disturbingly, several children from towns miles away began disappearing. The only connection each family had, at some point, distant blood ties to the Lancaster lineage. Rent left no journals, no public sermons, but what he did leave scratched into the pulpit in Latin was later translated as, "They are not buried, only waiting." That same year, a university group from Boston, led by a Professor Wallace Merton, arrived to conduct a historical excavation of the area. They were experienced, careful, armed with maps and documents thought lost to time. For the first 2 weeks, all was quiet. They unearthed clay pipes, old communion chalices, fragments of children's dolls scorched by fire. But by the third week, their excavation reached the basement of the Lancaster estate. That's when they began to change. Transcripts from the groups, journals later discovered in a storage crate in Providence, Revell. The team began reporting mirrored dreams and time loops within the house. Merton himself wrote, "The clocks are moving counter to the sun. I spoke to a woman who claims to be my mother, but she died in 1881. She said the family is inside me now." 3 of the 8 students would never return. 2 were institutionalized. 1, a woman named Harriet Deems, would go on to write a cryptic and disturbing memoir titled We Entered Through the Mouth. In it, she describes an underground room beneath the Lancaster estate, built in concentric circles, where the walls seemed to whisper and skin grew like wallpaper. The final page of her book reads, "They are not human, not anymore." From that point forward, no official records mention Millfield again. Government documents list it as uninhabitable. The last census that included it, 1890, was destroyed in a fire at the Department of Commerce. And in the years that followed, the land around the old Lancaster property became known only as the Fold. Those who wander too close report missing time, devices stop working, animals refuse to cross certain thresholds, and satellite imagery always returns distorted when focused on the area, as if the land itself rejects observation. But the family's influence never truly died. Across the eastern seaboard, particularly in institutions of high finance, law, and medicine, one name resurfaces again and again under slight variations: Lancaster, Lanquist, Langston. Their genealogies trace back to no origin, their public records immaculately clean, and their family crests all bear a single shared element: the black candle in the circle of thorns. It's a symbol now whispered about in deep cryptology circles and conspiracy forums, a mark of hidden lineage, of bloodlines that serve something older than government, older than faith. What remains most disturbing is the theory, quietly circulating among those who've dared study. The fragments of the Lancaster legacy. The family never died out. They just shed their skins. They shed their skins and moved into positions of power so subtle, so deeply embedded in the American structure, that no one thought to question them. The Lancaster influence, according to researchers who have dared speak openly, was never about political office or overt wealth. It was about shaping the institutions beneath power: the archivists, the regulators, the credentialed, the ones who decide who gets to speak and who gets erased. Between 1910 and 1940, a wave of inexplicable policy decisions swept across state governments in New England. Laws concerning inheritance, land rights, psychiatric and orphan custody were rewritten with cryptic language, often citing precedent that could never be traced. The lawyers responsible all came from obscure firms bearing no consistent name, yet linked by one chilling fact: each firm's founder bore a faint resemblance to members of the Lancaster lineage, even though all the Lancasters had reportedly perished decades before. And then came the orchid. Files leaked in 1962 by a defecting government contractor. These redacted dossiers referenced an internal surveillance effort codenamed Black Stem. The program monitored obscure family trees believed to carry non-conforming biological signatures. At the top of that list, Subject CL20, Langstray, Lancaster. The documents reference unexplained health anomalies in these families: no cancer, unusually low mortality before age 90, high fertility rates, and a genetic marker identified as segment delta 6, which appears nowhere else in the global genome catalog. Internal memos warned, they are not aberrations, they are instructions. The files also contain witness reports from foster homes and orphanages in the 1950s and 60s. Children with no official origin, fluent in Latin at age 4, displaying knowledge of pre-revolutionary rituals. Several staff members at the Arlington orphanage in Maine reported recurring incidents of children carving identical symbols into their skin, often while sleepwalking. The symbol matched the circle of thorns. And yet, every facility that filed reports was eventually closed due to budget cuts, fire, or structural instability. Every caseworker who pushed for further investigation either resigned without explanation or died in accidents: automobile crashes, drownings, house fires. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Meanwhile, institutions thought to be beyond such influential, Harvard, the NIH, began quietly revising their archives. Entire departments dedicated to genealogy, esotericism, and occult anthropology were dissolved or absorbed into modern cultural studies. One unnamed professor wrote before disappearing, "There are families in America who are not here to assimilate. They are here to propagate." In 1971, a secret conference known only as the Conclave of Three was held at an undisclosed location in the White Mountains. Attendees included a Vatican emissary, to Defense Intelligence Agency analysts, and a woman known only as Mrs. Omsworth, who spoke under a voice-altering device and refused to be photographed. The topic of the conclave: containment of ancestral anomalies. Declassified transcripts from a bugged hotel room linked to the event contain one of the most chilling statements in modern American esoteric history. It is not their blood that holds the power, it is their memory. They are born remembering, and they never forget what was promised to them. From then on, incidents involving ancestral anomalies were not handled through public channels. They were redirected to black subdivisions with nondescript titles like Office of Integrative Lineage or Division of Legacy Containment. These branches have no phone numbers, no websites. Their staff never appear in any government directories. In 1983, a rural schoolteacher in Vermont named Abigail Mars was institutionalized after submitting a manuscript titled They Crawl Through Generations. The work, a mixture of local folklore, genealogy, and confession, detailed the rise of a family whose children were born with no belly buttons, who feasted on salt and silence, and whose goal was not dominion, but return. She wrote, "They do not seek to rule this world, they seek to make it like the place they came from." The manuscript was immediately classified as delusional literature and sealed under the state's mental health suppression statutes, but a single surviving photocopy, passed through underground literary circles, continues to circulate, under the title The Skin Memory Doctrine. In it, Mars asserts that these families do not merely recall their ancestors, they carry their literal consciousness, that when one dies, another is born already knowing every secret, every betrayal, every promise made in blood. And that some of these children no longer cry when they're born. A fire ripped through the northern wing of the Westboro State Hospital in Massachusetts, officially attributed to faulty wiring. The incident killed 14 patients, yet what made headlines in local papers for a single day was quickly scrubbed from history. No funerals, no families stepping forward to claim remains, just ashes. But an anonymous letter, sent to 3 different radio hosts in the region, told a very different story. One host, known as Trent Midnight, read excerpts live on air before his program was abruptly cancelled and all recordings seized. The letter described a hidden floor beneath the hospital, constructed before the Civil War and sealed off in 1942. That floor housed what staff called listening rooms, chambers, lined in lead, without electricity, soundproofed entirely. According to the letter, the patients housed there were not allowed visitors. They were not fed in front of cameras. They were not sedated by medication. They were sedated by music. Gregorian chants played at 432 Hz, repeated for hours, for days. Staff rotated in 2-hour shifts, not for the safety of the patients but for their own, because those locked within the rooms had a way of speaking without sound, and were capable of projecting vivid waking nightmares into the minds of those nearby. These weren't delusions. The letter claimed that Westboro fire began in room 6L, where a patient identified only as Child 13 was kept. Her record had no date of birth, just a note, arrived knowing Latin, Arabic, and a language not yet identified. It described how, the day before the fire, She stopped responding to the music, just smiled. Staff who entered her cell reported nausea, auditory hallucinations, and the sensation of their teeth falling out, though no physical damage was ever found. Hours before the fire, the building's blueprints vanished from state records. Emergency exit maps on every floor were replaced with mismatched diagrams. Phone lines were cut. What happened between 3:12 a.m. and 5:48 a.m. remains undocumented except for a single voice recording recovered from a melted tape deck found in the boiler room. On it, someone is breathing rapidly, repeating a phrase in a trembling voice. She has no shadow. She has no shadow. She has no shad. Then silence. Since that day, sightings of the girl with no shadow have been reported across the East Coast, usually in places linked to old families, religious properties, or orphanages. She is always described the same way: long black hair, pale skin with a strange sheen, and eyes that reflect light like a cat's in darkness. She speaks to no one, but those who see her often suffer sleep paralysis for weeks afterward, accompanied by dreams of twisted staircases and women whispering behind walls. One man, a former Navy cryptologist who saw her near the ruins of the burned St. Eligius Chapel in Rhode Island, was later found catatonic, having scrawled the words "they never died" into his skin with a fork. His wife reported that in the days before, he became obsessed with an old ledger of family names, many of which traced back to the Lancaster bloodline. Now consider this. What if the anomalies weren't errors in biology, but carefully preserved designs? What if their survival through fire, through institutional collapse, through genetic dilution, was not an accident, but a return to form? Every generation, reborn closer to what they once were. And what if they're not waiting anymore? What if the institutions that once hunted them, now serve them? From 1995 onward, a new wave of think tanks and private biomedical startups began quietly acquiring land across rural America, land that had belonged to families erased in the 1800s. These startups, often bearing names evoking purity and restoration like Novogenesis or Eden, code claimed to be developing advanced gene therapy, but internal documents leaked to a fringe journalist in 2003, later found dead in a flooded elevator shaft, contained one disturbing term repeated across contracts and internal memos: reconstitution. What is being reconstituted? The journalist's final article, published hours before his death, simply read: they are not making new humans, they are retrieving old ones. Retrieving old ones. You've heard the phrase bloodlines of power, but what if that wasn't metaphorical? What if there are families, ancient, deliberate, biologically distinct, who were never part of the common human story, who never believed in nations, borders, or religions because they predated all of it? Families who watched the rise of Rome, the Crusades, the birth of America, not as participants, but as observers, or worse, designers. These families do not operate from castles or public office. They do not attend World Economic Forum panels or grace the covers of magazines. They operate from within the folds of decay: abandoned churches, crumbling hospitals, old mining towns, and shuttered boarding schools. They live among rot. They hide in places society forgets because that is where memories are most fragile. Consider the pattern. Every few decades, a discovery is made: a sealed wing in a hospital, a hidden room in a plantation, a locked archive in a university basement. Inside, human remains, malformed skeletons, strange equipment, handwritten records in non-standard scripts, and always local authorities shut it down, declare it historical, irrelevant, or dangerous, then quietly erase it. Why? Because every so often, they fail to clean up in time. Because every so often, something survives. In 2006, a group of spelunkers in Kentucky entered an unmapped cave system near Pulaski County. Deep within, they found more than limestone. They found a sealed wooden door square, reinforced with iron, impossible to date. Behind it, a chamber carved into hexagonal tiles at the center, a dry well. Inside that well, bones, and not just bones, vertebrae with abnormal ridges, skulls with double occipital plates, jaw structures inconsistent with any known race. Before they could alert officials, 2 of the spelunkers vanished. The rest were detained by a private archaeology task force linked to a now-defunct company called Meridian Deep Works. Their report was never published. The cave was sealed with concrete. The survivors, when contacted years later, refused to speak. One of them repeatedly writing the same word on napkins and paper scraps: resurgence. Now pair that with what's happening in the modern world. DNA testing is everywhere. Consumer kits promise you insight into ancestry, health, even personality. But do you really think those billion-dollar companies exist just to tell people they're 14% Scandinavian, or are they searching? Not for diversity, not for disease, but for a very particular sequence, a long silent allele buried deep in the genome, one that doesn't belong in modern humans, one that only appears in 0.0003% of samples, and every time it's found, the sample is flagged, removed from databases, and the customer receives an innocuous refund and apology. Your sample was compromised, but it wasn't compromised, it was claimed, because some families, even now, still know the signs. They know what to look for. They know the patterns. They can smell it in blood, feel it in proximity, sense it when something long dead is trying to speak again through the nervous system of a living host. These are not possessions. This is heritage. And when that heritage activates, things begin to happen. The individual begins to speak languages they've never studied. They develop an aversion to light, religious symbols, or certain musical tones. They begin drawing geometric diagrams compulsively, often in ash, blood, or chalk. They complain of voices that speak not in commands, but in memories. It is a reconnectation, not spiritual, not alien, ancestral, and those who do not suppress it, who embrace it, a terrifying clarity. They no longer fear death. They no longer recognize family members. Their dreams become maps not of physical space, but of bloodlines, structures, and ruins. And often, they begin walking at night, unshod, toward locations they've never seen, but somehow remember. Locations with names scratched out of history. Places like Greybourne Hollow, Maine, the Arcady Trench, Arizona, St. Ioseph's Parish, Maryland, the Everglass Nursery, Vermont. Places where architecture bends toward unnatural angles. Places where compasses spin, where sound doesn't echo right, where the laws of nature don't fully apply. These are not haunted places, they are anchored places, anchors to blood, to memory, to families that never left. When you trace back these names, Greybourne, Arcady, Fairfax, Corraway, Latimer, you begin to notice something chilling. They don't just appear in folklore or dusty registries, they appear as architects of institutions, quiet funders of medical colleges, sponsors of orphanages, donors to churches that no longer have congregations, owners of mining operations where dozens disappeared without media coverage. They've changed their roles, adjusted their masks, but one thing never changed: their obsession with control through blood, and not just bloodlines, bloodwork, hematology, transfusions, serums, even ritual bloodletting repackaged as experimental therapy. Starting in the 1800s, these families shifted from spiritual to scientific manipulation, disguising their ancient rites as cutting-edge medicine. They didn't do this for profit. They already had wealth that spanned generations. No, they did it to legitimize extraction, to take from the bodies of the unaware what once was only taken through violence and coercion. Let's go deeper. In 1939, a facility known as the Allerton Clinic opened in upstate New York. On the surface, it was a home for children with unique neural patterns, privately funded, quiet, no press. But behind the mirrored glass and sedation protocols, something far more insidious was happening. Children weren't being treated, they were being sorted. Their blood was categorized based on obscure, non-standard markers: viscosity, response to silver, coagulation under sigil-shaped magnets. Some children were simply dismissed. Others were kept for years, studied, and eventually removed from records altogether. One nurse, who later leaked documents to an independent journal before disappearing herself, said this: they weren't trying to fix the children, they were trying to awaken something inside them, and when it awoke, it didn't recognize love, family, or even its own name. It only recognized ... purpose. What was that purpose? To restore what had been fractured. Centuries ago, these bloodline families didn't just rule, they communed with something pre-human, not a god, not a devil, but a kind of awareness buried beneath the framework of the world. It had no form, only gravity. It drew minds into its orbit, reshaped will, and seeded commands into generations. But, over time, those commands began to fade. The lines became weak, diluted. The families needed new carriers, new blood vessels strong enough to withstand reconnection. Hence the medical clinics, the gifted orphanages, the off-book institutions. These weren't places of healing, they were labs for inheritance, and once every few years, they found a viable vessel, someone whose blood didn't curdle in the presence of ancestral tones, whose mind didn't fracture under ancestral memory, whose spirit didn't flee at the touch of something ancient and nameless. And when they found that person, they disappeared, given a new name, inserted into places of influence not in politics or entertainment, but in decision-making architecture, executive boards, classified think tanks, urban redevelopment projects, quiet places where new foundations are laid. Because the bloodline agenda is not conquest, its resurgence to return the world to a structure before humanity mattered, before emotion, before freedom, before the illusion of individuality. To rebuild society not as a home but as a vessel, a living temple of flesh, built on ritual geometry, activated through selective suffering, and maintained by people who think they're in charge but are really repeating ancestral designs encoded in their blood without knowing. You've felt it, haven't you? That eerie familiarity in places you've never been. That dream of a building that doesn't exist but feels like home. That unshakable discomfort when certain symbols appear in public art, corporate logos, or children's cartoons. That's not coincidence, that's resonance. You're not being programmed, you're being reminded. Now listen closely. There are towns more, almost forgotten, where the architecture itself is a language. Towns where roads bend in unnatural curves, aligning not with terrain, but with something older, buried. The locals call it charm, but when you walk those streets at night, something else moves with you. Not a person, not a shadow, a memory embedded in stone. These towns weren't built for people, they were built as containers. Take Eldon Parish, Louisiana, never officially mapped, never appearing on post-1971 census data, founded by a man named Gideon Carraway, a distant cousin to the infamous midwife line in Massachusetts. Eldon Parish had no mayor, no school, no hospital, but it had one thing. The Ring House, an octagonal mansion with no windows, a ceiling made of mirror tiles, and a subterranean network of rooms too geometrically perfect to be accidental. One child who escaped the town in 1994 described it in her journal. Every Friday, the bells would ring not from a church, but from underground. We'd be told to lie flat on the floor and hum a note we were taught in infancy. It wasn't a song, it was ... a summoning. What was being summoned? That's the question no one outside Eldon Parish ever answered. Because the girl vanished 2 months after releasing her journal, the house burned down, and the town was condemned after a chemical spill that no agency could confirm. But before the fire, an investigator photographed something inside the Ring House's central room, a sculpture made of infant teeth, copper wiring, and preserved animal hearts. It formed a spiral, a very specific one. A Fibonacci pattern interrupted every 7th node. That alteration isn't random. It appears in ritual diagrams dating back to Mesopotamia. Why? Because the goal isn't just communion. It's correction. Some ancient force believes the world has gone off course. That human freedom, randomness, even love, have disrupted the original architecture of existence. And the bloodline families, they see themselves not as villains, but as engineers of return. Eldon Parish was one experiment. There are others, places where no birds sing, where schoolchildren draw the same unseen symbol without knowing why, where local rivers never reflect the sky correctly, where dreams feel more real than waking life because you're not dreaming, you're being called. Understand this. The elite bloodlines don't want your money. They don't even want your loyalty. They want your compliance with ancient memory. They want you to remember a time when humans didn't rule the earth but served it, when the flesh was a tool for transmitting intention from a realm beneath logic. A place before light, where willpower bled into form. And if that sounds far-fetched, ask yourself this. Why do so many of the world's elite build underground sanctuaries? Why are so many modern structures designed without natural geometry? What? Are you right now feeling the pressure at the base of your spine? It's not fear, that's recognition. Your blood remembers the shape of the spiral. Your bones remember the sound of the bell. You've walked these halls before in a life that never had a name. In a world where your soul didn't belong to you. And if they have their way, it won't again. You were never supposed to know about Ashgrove Hall, not because it was forgotten, but because it was erased. Built in 1831 on the outskirts of Providence, Rhode Island, Ashgrove was never listed as an estate, asylum, or monastery. It existed in the margins. No records, no tax filings, no map entries. But according to a letter smuggled out in 1904 by a man known only as Mr. J, the estate was used by 7 families, the same bloodlines who trace their origins to pre-Christian Babylon as a testing ground. Testing for what? For what they called inheritance without memory. Here's what the letter said. They bring in infants not always born here, but always unregistered. The infants are raised without speech, no language, no names. At 6 years old, they are placed in the mirror, chamber, where they are shown not reflections, but images retrieved from blood, patterns, moving shapes, places they have never been but react to as if returning. Some collapse, some scream, some begin to whisper in tongues that haven't existed since the stars were aligned differently. That's not science, that's not psychiatry, that's ancestral possession. The elite families don't believe in raising children, they believe in harvesting them, as vessels, as codes, as locks waiting to be opened by a very specific emotional trigger. You've heard of trauma-based mind control, but what if it goes deeper? What if trauma doesn't create obedience but awakens memory? That's what they fear and crave. Because at Ashgrove Hall, the goal was not to break the mind, it was to release something inside it, something ancient, something they call the first voice. Every child showed different symptoms. One girl would weep whenever exposed to iron. Another boy began drawing star maps that matched no known constellations but lined up perfectly when viewed from beneath the surface of the earth, as if seen from the other side. And one, the last survivor, kept repeating a phrase in a dead language scholars still can't identify. Translated roughly, it meant, "The gods buried in flesh shall rise by sorrow's echo," and then he vanished. Ashgrove Hall was dismantled brick by brick, the stones scattered across 6 countries. But no one ever found the basement. According to those who tried, the land beneath the foundation didn't follow ordinary geometry. It spiraled downward, ceilings became walls, light behaved like liquid, and in the center was a door that didn't open to anywhere in this world, but it heard you when you stood near it. You felt watched, not by an entity but by the blueprint of what you once were, a design more ancient than DNA, a memory, older than civilization, something in your bones that still listens for the voice that once commanded it. That's what the families want back, not wealth, not control, but reunion with the thing they were made to forget. And they'll use anyone, anything to get it, even you, even you. Ashgrove Hall's basement was not forgotten. It was sealed not by bricks, but by bloodlines. And if you think that's metaphor, you're not listening closely enough. After the disbandment of Ashgrove in 1904, no official records mention it again, but in private correspondences between 2 secretive societies, the Order of the Nine Doors and the Icarian Communion in Ashgrove, is referred to as a wound in the flesh of history, something that can reopen, something that was never truly closed. So what happened? Why would elites risk so much to bury this place? Because it was a catastrophic success. They unlocked something in those children, not demons, not madness, but remnants of selves that didn't belong to the present. There's one name that keeps surfacing, always written in code, always veiled by metaphor. They call it the listener beneath the pattern, sometimes the archive, sometimes just he who dwells, but the most chilling, the child that watches the children. This entity or imprint was described by the children of Ashgrove as a boy with no face, only a mouth that whispered your own name in reverse. He did not command them, he reminded them of what he reminded me, what I swore to forget. One child wrote in smeared charcoal. The researchers called it a not localized intelligence consciousness that didn't dwell in time, but the children, they just called him brother. Now here's where it fractures deeper. A secret dossier recovered from the now destroyed Belden crypt archives revealed that Ashgrove's architecture matched the internal layout of an unearthed Sumerian ziggurat dating back to 6000 BCE, same dimensions, same spiral sequence, even the doorless chambers. Except Ashgrove had one additional element, a mirror, installed not on a wall but suspended in the air, aligned with the magnetic pole of the Earth at the time of a specific lunar eclipse in 1843. Why? Because they weren't observing the children, they were inviting something through them. One survivor, never named, labeled subject A3-11, was later found in a Catholic orphanage in Nebraska, drawing concentric circles in dust and mumbling, "It didn't come through the mirror, it came through me, I'm not me, I'm us now." This wasn't science. This wasn't madness, it was re-entry. They weren't trying to contact the past, they were trying to bring it back through us, drove us. But what they found was not controllable, because memory isn't just a recollection, it's a summoning. And once you remember what you are, you can never go back to what they told you are. Let's talk about the children who didn't make it out, the ones who never returned home, who were never spoken of again. They weren't missing, they were taken, intentionally erased, not just from records, but from reality as we understand it. You see, in one of the final entries of the Ashgrove Physician's Journal dated February 19, 1904, just weeks before the place was shut down, he writes something so unsettling, it was blacked out in every surviving copy. But in one carbon photographed version, The redacted text bled through slightly, and here's what it said. They're no longer children. They are memories given form. They move without sequence, speak languages no one taught them, and they've begun swapping places with things that look exactly like them. He didn't mean twins, he meant replacements. One of the staff reportedly walked into a room to find a child sitting upright, in bed, motionless, eyes wide open, smiling at him. Except this child had been confirmed dead and buried 3 weeks prior. When the staff member tried to alert others, he vanished that night. No resignation, no trace. His name appears on no employee ledger past that date. The ones who vanished didn't disappear. According to scattered testimony from covert psychiatric logs and recovered letters, they became vessels but for whatever was being conjured, remembered or awakened at Ashgrove wasn't content to remain buried in dreams or ritual it wanted to inhabit. And those children, they were the perfect doorways. Now you understand why Ashgrove was sealed and denied. It wasn't a scandal. It was a containment effort, a desperate attempt by those in power to shut a door that should never have been opened. Because what was unleashed in Ashgrove didn't stay there. It learned, it spread, it remembered others, and worst of all, it still knows the names of those who remember it. Even now, even you. Now let's trace the trail left behind, not in public records, but in the children's drawings that resurfaced over the decades. These weren't ordinary doodles. They weren't idle sketches of horses, families, or sunshine. These were geometric distortions, repetitive glyphs, and fractal diagrams far beyond the cognitive level of a 6 or 7. But they appeared again and again, across different states, years apart, drawn by children never known to be connected to a showhove. Same spirals, same shapes, same faceless figure always standing in a doorway, always surrounded by tiny, backward letters. Some of the drawings, carbon-dated and preserved in the Blackridge collection of occult anthropology, contained sequences that matched Sanskrit numerals, Etruscan burial markings, and even Egyptian tomb inscriptions, despite being created by children in small-town America who had no exposure to such ancient languages. It's as if Ashgrove opened something that echoed outward, a kind of psychic residue or worse, a contagion of memory. We're not talking about telepathy, we're talking about a shared subconscious architecture that behaves like a virus traveling through symbols, language, and forgotten bloodlines. You think you're immune, that because you weren't there, you're safe. You're not. Because this wasn't about the building, it was about the design and architecture of the mind that can be replicated, reactivated by simply being remembered. Think of it like this. Ashgrove wasn't a location. It was a code written in the minds of children, waiting for a generation weak enough, curious enough, or arrogant enough to unlock it again. And there are whispers deep in the psychiatric wards of abandoned state hospitals of children born in the last 20 years, drawing identical diagrams, reciting names that don't exist, speaking languages no one recognizes, and mentioning a place that no adult remembers. Ashgrove, a word that carries weight without context, a forgotten door you've never opened. But that feels strangely familiar, because you don't need to visit Ashgrove Hall, you just need to know about it. And now you do so. What happened to Ashgrove Hall? Why isn't it in the history books? Why, in a nation obsessed with cataloging every crime, every scandal, every unexplained phenomenon, is Ashgrove never mentioned? Because Ashgrove wasn't just hidden, it was unwritten, not erased in the typical sense, not burnt down, not demolished. It was intellectually and spiritually nullified. After the final investigations in 1904, when several federal agents entered and allegedly cleared the building, something happened that no agency would publicly acknowledge. The blueprints vanished. The land records were misfiled. The census entries for the region between 1899 and 1905 are missing. Even newspaper archives from that year were reportedly heavily water damaged, but only in stories referencing the school. One surviving reporter, Harold Eames, a junior correspondent for the Grover Dispatch, left a chilling letter to his sister, now preserved in a private archive. They say the school was built over a failed church, but it's older than that, older than English, older than human. And I swear to God, Margaret, I saw one of them, not a child, not a man, something between covered in eyes that didn't blink, and a mouth that didn't open, but I still heard it say my name. Eames was institutionalized 6 days later, never published again. But here's what's more disturbing. Ashgrove Hall is still physically there, somewhere in a tract of private forest in southern Maine. Owned under shell corporations and protection clauses, the ruins remain, the walls cracked, but intact, the basement sealed, no trespassing signs posted, not by local police, but by federal authorities with no listed department. And according to drone footage leaked in 2017 before it was taken offline, there were lights in the lowest window, moving lights, not flashlight, beams pulsing, rhythmic, deliberate, as if the building was breathing. So don't ask why Ashgrove Hall disappeared. Ask instead, who needed it gone, and why is it still breathing underground? Because the moment we remember it, the moment we say its name, we feed it, and now, so have you. So have you.